This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Daniel Mahoney his latest book, The Other Solzhenitsyn, Telling the Truth About a Misunderstood Writer and Thinker. Daniel Mahoney holds the Augustine Chair and Distinguished Scholarship at Assumption College. He is the author of books on Raymond Aron, Charles de Gaulle, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and Bertrand de Jouvenel, and he has edited and co-edited a number of books, including The Solzhenitsyn Reader, which he co-edited with Edward Erickson. Daniel Mahoney, glad to have you on the program.
My pleasure.
Dan, I thought a good way to begin this interview about the other Solzhenitsyn is to read your opening paragraph from the foreword, and I'll step back after I read it and get your comment on it. You say, "No writer or thinker in recent times has been subject to more misinterpretations or even calumnies than the great Russian writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. His courage and tenacity are acknowledged even by his fiercest critics, yet the world-class novelist, historian, and moral philosopher has largely been eclipsed by a caricature particularly widespread in the Anglophone world that has transformed a passionate but measured and self-critical patriot into a ferocious nationalist, a thoughtful partisan of grassroots democracy into a quasi-authoritarian, a man of faith and reason into a religious zealot." How has this process, this misunderstanding, happened?
Well, it unfolded over many, many years, and it probably codified in the 1970s. It's interesting. There was something of a similar problem for Solzhenitsyn before he was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1974. He writes that with the publication of August 1914, the beginning of the 1970s, a large part of his Russian readership, an underground readership that had lionized him and had considered him to be, a representative of Russian descent, they turned on him when they realized he was a patriot, not attached to the Soviet Union, but a patriot attached to his country, Russia, and when he was Christian. So there was that first break when it was realized he wasn't a liberal secularist, that his alternative to communism was not rooted in another version of left secularism.
Okay.
In the West, it was a slower process. Solzhenitsyn had published a letter to the Soviet leaders. He wrote it in the fall of 73. It was published in the West in 74. And in that letter, he had made very clear that he had expressed certain judgments about the world. He had expressed views about Russia's future, which again ended up being caricatured. But when it became clear that he was not a liberal of the West, of the fashionable sort, people began to turn on him. Even conservative-minded people. William Safire wrote a nasty column comparing Solzhenitsyn to Rasputin in 1974. But I would say the definitive turning point occurred with the Harvard address. Solzhenitsyn gave a commencement address at Harvard University on June 8, 1978. It's a very important and powerful document, widely misunderstood in my view. Solzhenitsyn was not condemning America per se. He said he spoke as a friend, but he wanted to convey some difficult truths. He praised the American democracy at the time of its founding for recognizing the connection between liberty and the great reserves of mercy and sacrifice in the Western spiritual and political tradition. But Solzhenitsyn was most critical of what he called anthropocentricity, the severing of freedom from any deference to something above the human will. So anthropocentricity is another term for man-centered humanism, a humanism that denies any transcendental point of reference. Solzhenitsyn also expressed some fashionable views about Indochina. He denounced the communist genocide after the American withdrawal from Indochina in 1975. He spoke about the coarsening of culture in the West, et cetera, et cetera. So I think with the Harvard address, there was a kind of crystallization of negative sentiment about Solzhenitsyn. And in some quarters, this went very far indeed. A Russian emigre named Etkind actually wrote an article accusing Solzhenitsyn of being a Russian Ayatollah, to which Solzhenitsyn responded in a very eloquent and passionate article in Encounter magazine in February 1980. I am not a Russian Ayatollah, but it really reached the point where Solzhenitsyn's conservative-minded defense of liberty and his affirmation of necessary connection between the older humane, spiritual, and philosophical traditions of Russia and the West, the necessity of those for a humanly meaningful liberty, all of that was seen as evidence of, theocratic propensities, or, that somehow Solzhenitsyn was against the rule of law, was against democracy. By the way, the last chapter of the Gulag Archipelago, the last paragraph of the third volume, the last volume of the Gulag Archipelago ends with the words, "There is no law," referring to the Soviet Union of 1968. And Solzhenitsyn makes very clear that the rule of law is an indispensable pediment of a decent and free society. But never mind, all those kinds of nuances got cut out in this critique, this growing consensus. And then, journalists began to repeat themselves. So a consensus develops, and then, it gets bandied about in the press and repeated, and even decent people and conservative-minded people begin repeating that consensus, or saying, I like Solzhenitsyn, but isn't he too theocratic, or isn't he anti-Western, or that kind of thing.
Maybe we should back up for 1 minute and just think about his life and biography. So we have someone who spends how many years in the Soviet prison camps in Siberia?
Solzhenitsyn wasn't all in Siberia. He was also in Kazakhstan, and he was in a special scientific research prison in Moscow. But he spent about 8 years in Soviet camps from 45 to 50, in prisons and camps from 45 to 53, and then he had been sentenced to perpetual exile in Kazakhstan, and he was in exile until 1956, so about 11 years in prison camp and exile. And then he was rehabilitated after Stalin's death during the Khrushchev years, and he was allowed to really go to the heart of Russia and teach. He taught math and physics in Russian schools, but his real profession was an underground writer, where he never thought these works would be published. He wrote books like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich for the drawer, really, hoping that someday in the very distant future these works would see the light of day. But almost a miracle in 1962, Nikita Khrushchev approved the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was the first book to really provide what one scholar has called the sliver of truth in the throat of power. It was the book that exposed the truth about the Gulag in a dramatically effective way, an account of one day in the life of a prisoner. But Solzhenitsyn had been a very faithful communist. He had been a captain in the Red Army during the Second World War, and it was the accident of being arrested. He had written some critical letters about Stalin to his best friend from high school. He was still a self-proclaimed Marxist at the time, but it was in the prisons and camps that the scales fell from his eyes. He not only abandoned Marxism, but he began to develop and evolve philosophically and spiritually. And it was really during that period from about 1945 to about 1953 that we see an evolution from Marxism to Christianity. We see the development of his mature philosophical and spiritual convictions.
Well, talk about this, because I think this. Let me just step back and ask you this question. Gulag Archipelago was published in the West when?
It was published in Russian on December 28th, 1973.
Okay.
In Paris, and then it was subsequently published a few months later in 74 in all the major European languages.
How was that received by the Western intellectual class?
I think the reception of the Gulag Archipelago was generally very favorable. George Kennan called it the greatest critique of a political regime ever written.
Yeah.
There were many favorable reviews in places like the New York Review of Books that would become less friendly to Solzhenitsyn over the years. And the book had a dramatic effect in France, where part of the intelligentsia was still a prisoner of Marxist categories and a certain kind of indulgence toward European totalitarianism. The book was not only a massive bestseller, but it led many prominent and particularly young scholars to abandon Marxism, and Bernard-Henri Lévy famously said that Solzhenitsyn was the Dante of our time. And so you could, yeah. So I think the Gulag Archipelago sold 35 million copies in all languages. It's still selling.
Yes.
Of all Solzhenitsyn's book, I think it's the one that had the most dramatic impact on world affairs. In fact, Solzhenitsyn has a beautiful image he uses in several of his books, including his autobiographical Oak and the Calf. And he says that with the publication of the Gulag Archipelago, Birnam Wood began to move. The famous line from Shakespeare's Macbeth, that with the publication of the Gulag Archipelago, you could see the beginning of the end of the Soviet system, and I think that's right. I think if you want to do a sort of analysis of the principal causes of the fall of communism, I think you have to place a strong emphasis on the act of truth-telling, which was the Gulag Archipelago. The fact that it exposed, in a very, very powerful way, the criminal nature of the Soviet regime.
Because
I have an appendix in my book from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's wife, Natalia Solzhenitsyn, and she makes very clear what makes the Gulag Archipelago so compelling and so fascinating is that it's not just a political accusation. It's also a philosophical and spiritual analysis. It's a work that reflects deeply on the human soul and under conditions, under extreme conditions.
Yeah.
It's. I think the character of the work, the personal voice of Solzhenitsyn, holds all of the different parts together: the philosophical investigation, the judicial analysis, the historical critique of communist repression, Solzhenitsyn's own autobiographical account. It's all held together by that voice, which is powerful and sardonic and really. That book. Joseph Brodsky called Solzhenitsyn the Homer of our time, and in a way, the Gulag Archipelago is an epic that's covering this underworld, this prison world, this world that took the lives of tens of millions of people, and that entailed the incarceration of 30 or 40 million people, and he does it with such power and effectiveness, and I love the subtitle of the Gulag Archipelago, an experiment in literary investigation.
I want to ask you, because I'm just thinking, so if the Harvard address is really the moment where he becomes a suspect figure and no longer is seen as a clear witness against communism and a positive witness for freedom, and he seemed to have all this baggage. If we say the Harvard address might be the moment when that really breaks open. It seems the themes, though, that are in the Harvard Address are throughout the Gulag Archipelago, and I'm just sort of wondering why it wouldn't have emerged in that book. Because when I read the Gulag Archipelago, what I see is this idea that that truth comes through suffering, that freedom is necessarily a participation in an order of truth that we're given, that it's not willful. Which is really the idea of that I think the modern West. I mean, if you think about what's the thumb sketch idea of freedom, it's something that I will for my own individual needs, and occasionally it gets out of control, and we have to have the law kind of bring us back under control. But there's no sort of notion that freedom and truth are in dialogue with one another. And it seems, as I'm listening to you talk, as I read your book, there's a connection here, I think, with the way the West perceive Solzhenitsyn, and also the way America seemed to react to Whittaker Chambers, who's another figure you've written on, a figure I've written on. And Chambers thought that his reception, as you know, Dan, was related to the fact that he was telling parts of about the truth of man, and also of, say, the Western tradition that the modern world had really shut the door on and didn't want to think about. And he was reminding them of that, so they kind of shut him out to that extent. And it seems we can say the same thing about Solzhenitsyn.
Well, that's all very well said. I couldn't agree more. I think if you look at all of Solzhenitsyn's work, whether it's the First Circle, whether it's in the First Circle, whether it's the Gulag, whether it's the occasional essays and speeches that address philosophical, political, and spiritual themes, they're united by precisely that recognition of the indispensable connection between liberty and truth, the directedness of the human person to something beyond himself. And Solzhenitsyn, is critical, implicitly and explicitly, of efforts to cut freedom off, to make it autonomous, to cut it off from the natural directedness of the human person to truth. And I think you're quite right that dialectic, as I've just described it, is central to the Gulag Archipelago. It's central to his other major writings. Maybe it was a little harder to see the spiritual themes of the Gulag Archipelago, especially in the middle section, the soul and barbed wire, are apparent enough, but the implications of that spiritual analysis for our Western societies was probably not fully appreciated by many, hasty readers of the book. Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, the remarkable thing is, as the Gulag Archipelago was completed in 1968, and nothing in the Gulag Archipelago is incompatible with the broad intellectual history, cultural analysis, and spiritual sketch that Solzhenitsyn provides in the Harvard Address. And Solzhenitsyn's very careful to emphasize that his own understanding is in accord with an older Western self-understanding. Some of the early critics of the Harvard Address appreciated that, George Will and Charles Kessler, that, compared to a later modernist understanding of freedom, there was something very thin about a later modernist understanding of freedom compared to the sort of rich philosophical account of the necessary connection between liberty and the moral contents of life that one finds in the works of Solzhenitsyn. So, as I said, the Harvard Address was in the beginning of the left's and the intellectual classes' break with Solzhenitsyn, but it was the kind of crystallization of that break. It was the moment when there was a point of no return, that these caricatures of Solzhenitsyn's hardened into a open distaste and repudiation of the man for, not being one of us, not being a Western, progressive, secular liberal.
Also, it seems, and this can be polemical, but while certainly Western intellectuals during the period of communist advance did not countenance the violence, and we could say maybe they looked the other way, many of them did, but there was a belief in the planning aspect that maybe kind of a secret or not so secret, desire to see that sort of large-scale planning and progress that communist nations were engaged in, to see it actually work. I mean, there was kind of a quiet faith, or at least an unwillingness to criticize what they were doing. It seems to me, just thinking very broadly, and here's this guy who has been subject to it and is saying, no, there actually is a core to human nature that can't be remade, and the attempt to remake it involves engaging in a lot of lies and a lot of violence.
Yeah, that's right.
And,
Solzhenitsyn
and
has
it's like
this
the
beautiful-
reminding to the West it was just hard to take, I think, maybe we can say.
Well, I think that's right. And Solzhenitsyn has a wonderful analysis in the Harvard Address of how this tendency of Western intellectuals to what he calls feel the kinship with communism. And it's not that the majority of them were communists themselves,
Yeah.
but the anthropocentricity, the idea
Yeah.
that this was a project done by man for man, you know, the commitment to a radical transformation of the world, the denial in principle of a transcendental source and measure of human freedom. All of that made communism appear to be a more consistent and radical version of their own categories, of their own modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And Solzhenitsyn was acutely aware of that. That again, he's not criticizing liberty. He's criticizing a liberty that has lost touch with the true spiritual foundations of freedom. But that kind of distinction was lost to many of Solzhenitsyn's critics.
What is the modern account of freedom that Solzhenitsyn is criticizing?
Oh, I think first of all, what he calls it anthropocentricity, as I mentioned before.
Yeah.
Anthropocentricity means rooting freedom simply in the imperatives of a humanism that makes no reference to anything out itself. So the human will becomes the measure of man.
Okay.
And as he says that the practical consequences of that is that freedom gets cut off from the rich reserves of mercy and sacrifice that inform the Western tradition for a millennium.
Mm-hmm.
Solzhenitsyn provides some version of what you might call the moral capital argument, that for a long time Western liberty depended upon the moral capital provided by an older civilization. And once that that tie with the moral capital of our civilization gets severed, then evil begins to grow. That he has a very suggestive phrase in the Harvard Address where he says freedom began to tilt toward evil.
Okay.
And in part because freedom was no longer had a measure for distinguishing good from evil.
Okay.
So Solzhenitsyn is a very eloquent critic of the sort of regnant moral relativism that's so dominant in our culture today.
If communism is in the past, why then should we still read Solzhenitsyn? Why should we still be concerned with what he had to say if we've seen how poorly communism worked and all of the damage that it did? Is his witness still relevant to us? I mean, I know that's a question you must take from time to time. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, to begin with, I'm not sure we've had a real coming to terms or giving accounts of communism. I mean, most young people simply have no idea of the ravages to the bodies and souls of human beings committed by communism in the 20th century. Yeah. We all know there's this immense double standard when it comes to the criminality of the right, Nazism in particular, and the criminality occasioned by the communist revolution of the 20th century. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think Solzhenitsyn's deepest insights, as I tried to suggest a moment ago, have less to do with the brutality of communism or the sheer number of people who perished at the hands of ideological despotism in the 20th century. Those are real concerns of Solzhenitsyn, of course. Mm-hmm. He wants to pay tribute to the Czechs. He wants to pay tribute to those who perished. But his deeper argument is this wasn't something alien to us. This is something that arose within our civilization, and it arose from a corrupt understanding of human freedom, an understanding of human freedom devoid of the spiritual underpinnings of liberty. And and hence I keep on coming back to this Solzhenitsyn idea of anthropocentric humanism. But Solzhenitsyn, there are others who have articulated that kind of distinction. Jacques Maritain, for example, the famous French Catholic Thomist philosopher, distinguished between integral humanism and anthropocentric humanism. That totalitarianism involved a repudiation of the spiritual sources and transcendental sources of human freedom. But our increasingly postmodern democracy, in a way, shares with communism a repudiation of the West. It shares with communism a repudiation of the values and virtues that were at the heart of traditional Western civilization. And it certainly shares with communism that repudiation of the dialectical interconnection between liberty and truth that we spoke of earlier in the conversation. So there's much of import, there's much wisdom about the human soul, there's much wisdom about the true nature of freedom, there's much wisdom about the errors in modernity that will continue to scar our freedom unless we gain a truer and more humane understanding of what it means to be free and responsible human beings.
In thinking about the other Solzhenitsyn, his time in exile in the West, I take it he was evicted from Russia or evicted from the Soviet Union because of the publication of the Gulag Archipelago?
That is absolutely correct, yes.
Okay. In exile, he spends time in Switzerland and also time in Vermont. And I don't know if there were other places where he was. What does he learn there? What helps? What does he take away from those experiences, and what does he criticize?
Solzhenitsyn's main activity when he was in the West, especially in Vermont, those 18 years in Cavendish, Vermont, with his family, his main activity was to write The Red Wheel, his great work of dramatized history on the Russian Revolution. But he certainly paid attention to what was going on in the West. He was mainly, in the 70s, he was mainly concerned about the weakness of the West. One of his famous collections of speeches and essays from that period is called Warning to the West, addresses he gave to the AFL-CIO and elsewhere, where he warned that there was a failure of courage in the West, that there was what he called in the Nobel lecture the Munich syndrome, the tendency to capitulate to a threatening totalitarianism. So that was one major theme of Solzhenitsyn in the 70s. He really worked to sort of buttress the will of the West to stand. And then we forget, before Reagan, during the Carter years, after Vietnam, the West looked weak. There were peace movements in Europe that wanted unilateral disarmament. The Soviets and their allies, the Cubans, were making huge advances in Africa. There was genocide in Vietnam and Cambodia. Things were moving in the wrong direction. So when Solzhenitsyn was first exiled in 1974, he was deeply concerned about the tilt of international politics toward the Soviet Union. That would all change in the 1980s. What he learned about the West, again, on the basis of the Harvard Address and his criticisms of some features of Western culture, there's a lot of people who think Solzhenitsyn was just an unremitting critic of America. But in a series of writings and speeches, including the last one he gave in Cavendish, Vermont, to the people of Cavendish at their town meeting in 1994, he said that what he most admired about Vermont were the traditions of local self-government, and he said this was really a model for Russians to follow, and a model that had not yet begun to be followed. So, and in his last major interview with Der Spiegel in 2007, I have a whole chapter where I analyze that interview because it's Solzhenitsyn's farewell statement to the West and the world. But Solzhenitsyn talks a lot about the importance of building democracy from the bottom up, and he said his experience of seeing, this kind of Tocquevillian theme, participatory democracy in both Switzerland and New England, helped fortify his commitment to that vision of democracy from the bottom up. So that was certainly one thing that some people think like Solzhenitsyn came to the West. All he did was write the Red Wheel. He didn't pay attention. He just got cranky and attacked modern cultural developments. But in fact, there were many things about the West he admired. There's a wonderful line in the Liechtenstein address, his last speech he gave in the West in September 1993. He said that he admired the civil liberty of the West, its political freedoms, and the private space each individual had under the rule of law. So, again, Solzhenitsyn could be very critical of legalism and the abuse of the rule of law, but he certainly thought that the political liberty of the West and the rule of law of the West was something that Russia needed to learn from. And, so...
Why Vermont? I was curious why he settled in Vermont.
Well, he writes about that in his memoir, which will be coming out soon, I think, in English, called The Little Grain. It's a sequel to The Oak and the Calf. It's his memoir about his 20 years in the West from 1974 to 1994. He wanted a safe place where he could write.
Okay.
Zurich, originally he came to Zurich because he was finishing work on the Red Wheel, and he had a famous book that came out in 1975 called Lenin in Zurich. Okay. But the problem was, people would literally knock on his door. He was living in downtown Zurich.
Okay.
And it wasn't so easy to escape from the KGB, and he didn't have time to work or sufficient leisure for work.
Okay.
So the thought was to go somewhere where there was there was more opportunity to work, where there was less crowds, where there was less pressure. At first he thought of going to Norway, but he says in the Little Grain he wanted his children to grow up speaking great languages, and Norwegian, however charming, is not a great language. And so he wanted his kids educated in English, for example, as well as in Russian. And so they came to Vermont. I think another consideration was that Vermont kind of looked like Russia.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering
with the winter and the snow, and
yeah.
And I think he liked the small town community. He had a very cordial relationship with his neighbors in Cavendish. He 3 times addressed the town meeting. He, as I said a moment ago, really came to admire the kind of local self-government that was still alive and well in a town like Cavendish, Vermont.
Yeah. I thinking about his return then to Russia, it seems to me that's where there's like another wave of misunderstandings, of misunderstanding Solzhenitsyn begins to occur with the liberation of Russia from communism, and his sort of fit in that liberation, and how he interacts with certain elements, and how that's misunderstood in the West. So I wanted to talk with you about that part as well, because there's really the collapse. I mean, I say liberation. I shouldn't have said that. There's really a collapse of Russia after the fall of communism, widespread devastation. There's the looting of Russia. There's the rise of the oligarchs, etc. And Solzhenitsyn has to try and address that, and somehow, I think, write about what he's seeing. And he seems to be, there's this sort of the belief that he's a nationalist, that he's not really someone who's trying to help rehabilitate Russia, but is participating in something unseemly with his rhetoric and ideas. So maybe we can kind of finish on those themes, because they seem so prominent now in the West when people write about him. And in particular, you mentioned the Der Spiegel interview. We have there, many people say, an endorsement of Putin, or an endorsement of Putin's coming to power as a good thing, seen by Solzhenitsyn. But of course, you say it's a much more qualified endorsement of Putin, and it's
right.
a Putin at the beginning of his leadership, not what's happened in the years since.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the question of nationalism. That's a major theme in the book. Solzhenitsyn was a great Russian patriot, but he was not a nationalist. In fact, he's something of an isolationist. He was asked by Yanis Sapiev, a BBC interviewer, great interview in February '79, how did he envision Russia's future? And he said, 1,000 years of recuperation.
Recuperation.
Yeah, I mean that Russia really needed to recover. He said on another occasion that a great empire of the Soviet sort is incompatible with the moral health of the people. So when he came back to Russia after 1994, he was by no means an advocate of a restoration of the Soviet Empire or anything of the sort. And he was always very critical of radical nationalists who he said, put the self-assertion of the nation above a humble stance toward heaven. So I think I very effectively explode this legend that Solzhenitsyn was a nationalist. And he was most critical politically during this period in Russia of what was called the Red-Brown Coalition, the union of unrepentant communists with far-right nationalists and neo-fascists. That's an ugly combination.
Yeah.
And Solzhenitsyn was the scourge of the Red-Brown Coalition, or what were also called National Bolsheviks. People combine Bolshevism with radical nationalism. About Putin, I think you can only understand Solzhenitsyn's nuanced attitudes toward Putin if one understands his very harsh judgments about the Russian 1990s, which you alluded to.
Yeah.
In his speech to the State Duma in the fall of 1994, he thundered, Russia doesn't have a democracy. She has an oligarchy. And he wrote a book in 1998, which, by the way, called Russian Collapse, which contains some beautiful sections on the imperative of democratic self-government. But he says Russia doesn't have democratic self-government. It has a criminal kleptocracy. It has a mafia class. It has a oligarchy that has radically subverted the promise of democratic transformation since the fall of communism. I think Solzhenitsyn thought that Putin offered an opportunity to restore Russia after the disaster of the 1990s. He had some reservations. He couldn't have been all that crazy wild about Putin's KGB past, but he made clear in his interview with Der Spiegel that he says, look, Putin was never involved in the system of political repression. He was never a camp commander or a prison guard, or he wasn't complicit with the Soviet system of repression. Mm-hmm. He was a spy. And I think Solzhenitsyn also read Putin differently than many people in the West did. There's a tendency of some in the West to see, because Putin was a former KGB agent, they tend to read Putin as someone committed to what I call a neo-Soviet restoration, bringing back the Soviet Union. I think Putin's an anti-communist. He knows that the Soviet Union was a dead end, that it was a totalitarian state. One of his great political heroes is also Solzhenitsyn's political hero, Pyotr Stolypin, the last great reformer, the Russian old regime before the revolution, who was assassinated in 1911. So a lot of the press coverage about Putin is very narrow and gets things wrong. But my concern about Putin is he stayed too long.
Yeah.
And he came back after the Medvedev presidency. And I speculate that Solzhenitsyn, who said in his Der Spiegel interview that Russia very much needed a meaningful opposition, would be concerned about the continued concentration of power in Putin's hands. This is 2014. Putin originally came to power in 2000, so it's been 14 years. And Putin's played a role in the sort of closing up of political life in Russia. Not that it's a totalitarian state by any means. Not that it's even a purely authoritarian state. There's some political opposition, but not enough.
Yeah.
And the monopoly of political life in the hands of Putin has, closed off the possibility of a more meaningful democratic transformation in Russia. The other point I make is that Solzhenitsyn, in fact, I quote Mrs. Solzhenitsyn on this, Solzhenitsyn was particularly critical of the continuing failure of Putin's Russia to come to terms with the communist past. That there needed to be more transparency, more openness, more public repentance for the crimes of communism. There was too much defensiveness, not apologies, not apologies for the Soviet past, but a kind of defensiveness in really coming to terms with what communism entailed in the 20th century. And Solzhenitsyn was very, very critical of that. He was also very, very critical of the corruption in the country.
Yeah.
So this idea that he was some kind of uncritical apologist for Putin misses the boat.
Yeah, it seems to me, and you think about the quip, your criticisms of an idea reveal more about yourself than what you're actually arguing. It seems that the West, all things Russia are strange to us. It seems, or suspect, or mystifying in some way. And to see Putin or to see Solzhenitsyn really defend a Russian patriotism is to see someone defending a pan-Slavism or something like that. There's a struggle on our part, I think, to distinguish or differentiate what he was about. It seems also you write about what would Solzhenitsyn have confronted when he returned to Russia. He would have confronted, you said, a red-brown coalition, but then also a really a kleptocracy. And then something that just looked really weak on the other hand. No intermediate ground, no opposition, nothing that seemed to be having a really healthy response to what was going on. And maybe he's trying to provide that.
Well, that's right. I think the other thing, if you look back at Solzhenitsyn's political writings in the 70s, like the letter to the Soviet leaders, Solzhenitsyn said, look, we have to dispense with this corrupt ideology that demands lives of people, that suffocates the human soul. We need to get rid of censorship. We need glasnost. We need an opening up of the economy. We need religious freedom. Political freedom would come later because there had to be a gradual transition from what he called the icy cliffs of totalitarianism to a self-governing political order. I think too many people in the West thought this is some kind of automatic process, that you just get rid of communism and everything's going to be okay. That's not the way it works.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think, what does a totalitarian government do to moral responsibility in the lives of people? How would people understand themselves as accountable for the judgments they make, for participating in government, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, that process is going to be have been eroded, really.
Yeah, you really highlight one of Solzhenitsyn's major themes after his return to Russia in May 1994. He was deeply concerned about the erosion of character and moral responsibility. There's a beautiful chapter in Russian Collapse on the evolution of the Soviet character, and he talks about how lying and betrayal had become a way of life under the Soviet Union, and it's very, very difficult to restore the sort of fundamental character traits that are necessary for responsibility in a free society. He was acutely aware of that. Mm-hmm. And unlike people in the West who thought of totalitarianism as just the absence of political freedom, Solzhenitsyn knew it was a perverse form of soulcraft, that the human soul was being mutilated, and that it would take many generations to come. The wonderful image Solzhenitsyn used was come out from under the rubble of totalitarianism.
I want to ask you just on that question, that the soulcraft of totalitarianism. So, how does that play out going forward with Putin, in the sense of what does he really have to work with, and what does this really invite him to do in terms of guiding or shaping Russia? I mean, is there? I guess what I'm trying to say is these structures that Solzhenitsyn talked about of self-government, interestingly, he was asked about inequality in Russia, and he cites we need to actually lift restrictions to have an entrepreneurial culture, to have a small business culture. Right. And I guess the question is, what really does Putin have to work with there? And what is he taking advantage of, maybe to extend his rule in a bad way?
Well, where he's taken advantage to extend his role in a bad way has been with this sort of centralization of the political process at the top. There's a political opposition, as I said, but it's, the communists and Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democrats a responsible, moderate, middle-class opposition party doesn't really exist. You know, it's easy, it's sort of helpful for Putin that all the main opposition parties are losers. You know, nobody really wants them to rule.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, there have been some, as Solzhenitsyn points out in the Der Spiegel interview, there have been some halting efforts in Russia to move the country toward greater local self-government, but halting efforts. It has not been a major concern of the political order. What Solzhenitsyn always envisioned was building democracy from the bottom up so you can create citizens and therefore make the political process at the national level more meaningful.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, rather than just having a plebiscite every 2 or 4 or 6 years, you actually have citizens with the habits of citizens who are able to make meaningful choices. That doesn't exist in Russia. And it may not exist for the considerable future. And that's why I was criticizing Putin, because I thought that the centralization of the vertical power, as the Russians call it, has made it harder to introduce free political life. It's not that the system is a tyranny. It's a half-authoritarian order, but I hold Putin responsible, not for all the things he's held responsible for the West. I mainly hold him responsible for crowding out the habits of free political life.
Crowding out the habits. Yeah.
Yeah.
And thinking about just Putin's, thinking about the overall legacy of Solzhenitsyn, his communist or his anti-communist writings. So we've got the Gulag Archipelago, we've got the Red Wheel, we've got, and you write about lesser known, but hopefully will become greater known, In the First Circle. From this period, though, say the post-1994 period, addressing the problems of Russia, what should we read of Solzhenitsyn's to really understand his idea of a free society?
Yeah, Chapter 8 of my book deals with Solzhenitsyn's binary tales, which are these beautiful two-part short stories that Solzhenitsyn wrote in the 1990s, from 1993 to 1999. And they're just gems.
Okay.
They deal mainly with the soul of man under communism, but some of them deal with the soul of man under post-communism. They're jarring stories. Apricot Jam, which gives its name to the collection. It's available from Counterpoint in the United States. You can get it in paperback. These are beautiful stories. Apricot Jam is about a young boy, a kulak, who's dispossessed, has nothing left in the world. He writes to a famous writer who had returned from exile in the West and was a collaborator with the Stalinist regime. And the callousness of this writer, his inability to listen to the suffering of this young boy, it's just amazingly portrayed in a very compelling story. There's another story called Ego about a prison revolt, about a peasant revolt at the beginning of the Soviet regime against the Soviets, and it's fascinating because one of the leaders of the rebellion gets caught up in a situation where the Bolsheviks use his family as hostages, and he has to make a choice between doing the right thing and giving in so his family won't be harmed. A lot of the stories show those kind of moral conflicts where under a totalitarian regime one has to choose between family and the right thing to do. So those stories are terrific, and they're among the best things Solzhenitsyn ever wrote. And it's interesting, because the Red Wheel is 6,000 pages long, and the Gulag is 1,700 pages long, and these are massive works. Thank God the Gulag is available in an authorized abridgment. But the stories in Apricot Jam and other stories are anywhere from 20 to 40, 45 pages. So Solzhenitsyn returned to a shorter form in the latter part of his life. He also wrote miniatures or prose poems. You may remember them from the Solzhenitsyn Reader. They're really quite beautiful, spiritual meditations on nature, life, death, with sort of a political backdrop. So it's interesting, as he got older, his literary concentration, he concentrated on smaller forms rather than the massive the two massive cathedrals, Gulag Archipelago and the Red Wheel.
What would you say the Der Spiegel interview really provides kind of a nice summing up of his ideas about where Russia should go and how it could recover its political and freedom and also freedom for individials?
That's why
okay,
I devoted 45 pages of the Spiegel interview to a commentary, because here you had a great interview with Solzhenitsyn exactly a year before he died, where he lays out with great clarity his ideas on everything, on his work, on the West, on Russia, on the political evolution of the country, on religion, on, as you said, on the place and need for small business. It's all there.
It's all there.
And it's a very good place for getting a sense of Solzhenitsyn's mind. Again, it's funny, I read many of the critical responses, the journalistic responses to the Der Spiegel piece. I consider the Der Spiegel piece to be eminently moderate and sensible, but a lot of quotation, a lot of the journalistic responses just sort of highlighted Solzhenitsyn says a good word about Putin or something like that. There's this kind of this willful superficiality in addressing a text like that.
Yeah. I think that as well. It's something that we didn't get to today in our discussion, is just thinking about the anti-Semitism charge, which seems to me also taking something, a few sentences that Solzhenitsyn had written about Jewish involvement in communism, and then the onset of the Soviet Union, and then blowing that up or making that something that it wasn't. And it seems to me this is true with a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages of my book, as one reviewer put in a National Review, that I actually quote Solzhenitsyn at length.
Yeah.
For example, my analysis of 200 Years Together, his book on Russia's Jewish question, it's a detailed exegesis filled with quotations. And I always remember an interview Solzhenitsyn did with David Aikman, a sympathetic interviewer in Time magazine in 1989, and Aikman sort of just said, well, people say this about you, this about you, this about you, and Solzhenitsyn rather frustratingly said, they never give any quotes.
Yeah.
And I think if one allows Solzhenitsyn to speak for himself, to come back to the first paragraph of my book, one really does discover a man of moderation. Spirited, yes, but a man of moderation.
Yeah.
So you discover the measured and self-critical patriot. You discover a thoughtful partisan of grassroots democracy, and you discover a man of faith and reason rather than a religious zealot. But again, one has to free oneself from that kind of false consensus that developed in the years after the Harvard Address.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time. We've been talking with author Daniel Mahoney about his latest book, The Other Solzhenitsyn, Telling the Truth About a Misunderstood Writer and Thinker.
Thanks, Richard. It's been a great pleasure.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.